She had everything the world could offer: wealth, power, status. Yet on a cold evening in Chicago, a billionaire mother stepped into her private garage and heard something that froze her in place. It wasn't the hum of her luxury car or the city noise outside. It was the faint, broken cry of a child. Following the sound, she rushed toward the backyard, her heart pounding faster with every step. What she found was unthinkable. Her own little girl, once bright and full of life, now kneeling weakly against an iron fence, begging the neighbor's maid for a single piece of bread. Her body frail, her spirit crushed. How could a child from such wealth be reduced to this desperate state? And what dark secret could explain the nightmare that had unfolded behind closed doors? Before we start, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Catherine Morgan was the kind of woman people read about in magazines but rarely saw up close. At 40 years old, she was the CEO of Morgan Global Enterprises, a company that touched nearly every corner of international trade. Colleagues called her brilliant, relentless, unstoppable. The headlines praised her billion-dollar deals, her polished speeches, her elegant presence at galas and summits. From the outside, it looked like she lived the dream, seamless, glittering, untouchable. Yet behind the carefully crafted image was a woman who had been running for years. Catherine had buried herself in work after the tragic loss of her husband, Daniel, who died in a car accident 3 years earlier. His absence left a void too large to face. Rather than confront the grief, she drowned herself in negotiations, board meetings, and endless travel. She convinced herself it was strength, but deep down it was escape. At home, her daughter Olivia was left in the hands of a nanny. Catherine had told herself it was the best option, a way to ensure her little girl was cared for while she built a legacy. The nanny, Lillian Vargas, came with glowing recommendations and an expensive promise: to provide stability and healing for children dealing with grief. $10,000 a month seemed like a small price to pay for peace of mind. Catherine, exhausted from 12-hour workdays and back-to-back flights, accepted it without question. The penthouse they lived in stood high above Chicago's skyline, polished and silent, a place that looked beautiful in photographs but often felt cold inside. Catherine spent most of her nights dialing in from airports or luxury hotels, video calling Olivia for just a few moments. Every time she asked how her daughter was doing, Lillian chimed in with quick reassurances. She's eating well, she's reading late at night, she's just going through growth spurts. Catherine wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. The guilt of being absent pressed heavily enough without doubts. Still, something inside her occasionally stirred unease. Olivia's face on video calls seemed thinner. Her eyes carried shadows Catherine didn't remember, but she brushed it aside, chalking it up to bad angles, poor lighting, or simply her own imagination. After all, Lillian was the professional. Catherine told herself that her role was to provide, and Lillian's role was to nurture. That was the deal. Her business trip to New York had been one of her busiest yet. Endless conferences, late dinners with investors, back-to-back interviews with journalists eager to showcase the power of a woman who had risen above loss and built an empire. She wore the part perfectly, but inside, she longed for the quiet comfort of her daughter's arms. On the final night of the trip, as she prepared to board her private jet back to Chicago, she promised herself things would be different. She would cut back on work, spend more time at home, maybe even consider scaling down her empire. Olivia needed her. The city greeted her late that evening, its skyline glittering against the dark sky. Her luxury sedan slipped silently into the underground garage of the penthouse tower. Everything seemed normal: the hum of the engine, the sterile smell of concrete, the faint echo of her heels against the floor. For Catherine, it was supposed to be just another return, another late-night homecoming after yet another trip. But what she didn't know was that the walls she had built around her life, walls of money, power, and trust, were about to shatter. The perfect image she had maintained was nothing more than glass, and beneath it lay a truth far more harrowing than anything she had faced in boardrooms or business deals. Somewhere outside, in the shadow of her lavish home, her daughter's world had already collapsed. Olivia, once a chubby-cheeked, giggling child who loved bedtime stories and warm pancakes, was no longer the same. She had been pulled into a nightmare that Catherine had unknowingly allowed to grow in her absence. And the cruelest part? The one person Catherine trusted most to protect her daughter was at the very heart of it. This night would not end with Catherine setting down her suitcase or kissing her daughter goodnight. Instead, it would begin with a sound that would haunt her forever. A faint, fragile cry that pierced through layers of concrete and luxury, cutting straight into her heart. She had no idea that within minutes, she would stumble upon a scene no mother, billionaire or not, could ever imagine. Catherine's heels echoed sharply as she hurried out of the garage, following the faint cries she could not ignore. Each step made her pulse quicken. She moved past the manicured hedges and into the backyard, the cool Chicago air biting against her skin. Then she saw it. At the iron fence that bordered her penthouse property, a small figure was crouched low, arms wrapped around thin knees. It was Olivia, her only daughter, begging for bread from an elderly neighbor's maid. The child's hands trembled as she reached desperately for the crust offered by the woman on the other side. Catherine froze. The image before her cut deeper than any loss she had endured. Olivia's face, once round and bright, was hollow and sunken. Her hair, tangled and dull, fell limply over her shoulders. Her ribs pressed sharply against the fabric of clothes now far too large for her frail frame. The stench of neglect hovered in the night air. In that moment, Catherine felt as though the ground had vanished beneath her. She rushed forward, arms outstretched, but Olivia's reaction stopped her cold. Instead of smiling or calling, "Mom," the little girl crumpled, sobbing uncontrollably, clinging to her mother's waist as if terrified she would disappear again. Through tears, Olivia whispered words that shattered Catherine's heart. She believed her mother had abandoned her forever. The nanny, Lillian Vargas, had poisoned her mind. Olivia explained in broken gasps that Lillian told her she was unwanted, that her mother thought she was too annoying, too fat, too unworthy of love. And so, the child had wandered the streets for days, searching for scraps to survive. The neighbor's maid, an elderly black woman named Mrs. Harriet, looked on with sorrow. She explained how Olivia had collapsed outside her home that very morning, too weak to stand. She had offered water, food, and comfort, but the sight of a billionaire's daughter begging for bread still weighed heavily on her chest. The injustice struck Catherine like lightning. She thought of the glowing references, the high fees, the carefully worded promises that Lillian had sold her. Behind them had been nothing but cruelty. While Catherine closed billion-dollar deals, her daughter was starved, sedated, and broken down by the very person trusted to protect her. The hospital confirmed the horror. Doctors revealed Olivia had lost 22 pounds, her body riddled with malnutrition, dehydration, and sedatives. They called it what it was: abuse. Catherine sat at her daughter's bedside, her polished image stripped away, realizing she had been blind. Grief had made her vulnerable. Ambition had made her absent. And in that absence, a predator had thrived. But the nightmare was only beginning. Days later, while Olivia was still recovering, Catherine received a text message from Lillian. Instead of remorse, the nanny demanded a raise, mocking Olivia as overly dramatic. Suspicion roared in Catherine's mind. She ordered her head of security, Richard Lawson, to scour the penthouse for hidden footage. Hours later, what they uncovered nearly drove her to collapse. On screen after screen, Lillian's cruelty came to life. Recordings showed her locking Olivia in dark closets, hurling insults meant to erode a child's spirit, and forcing sedatives into her food. In one chilling clip, she was overheard boasting in Spanish, "Rich widows are the easiest targets. A few more weeks and this child will be fully conditioned, obedient and broken. The evidence painted a picture far more sinister than simple neglect. This was not a nanny acting alone. It was a deliberate, calculated system of abuse. And when Catherine's investigators probed deeper, the truth became unbearable. Lillian Vargas was an alias. Her real name was Veronica Salazar, a woman tied to an underground network specializing in exploiting wealthy families. The discovery raised a new terror. If Olivia had been her victim, how many other children had suffered the same? Inside Lillian's private suite at the penthouse, the investigators uncovered stolen jewelry, designer gowns, and bottles of fine wine, all flaunted on social media as her own. But the most chilling find was a hidden hard drive. It contained videos of abused children, packaged and sold online for $600 apiece, funneled through secret networks in Europe. Catherine's chest tightened as she scrolled through the evidence. This was not just her story. This was hundreds of children, families shattered, lives destroyed, all hidden beneath the polished surface of wealth and respectability. She knew then that confronting Lillian directly was not enough. The woman had to be exposed, not just as a cruel caretaker, but as the head of a predator ring. So Catherine set a trap. She called Lillian back to the penthouse under the pretense of discussing her salary. What Lillian didn't know was that federal investigators, hidden cameras, and even a live news crew were already waiting in the shadows. When Lillian entered the living room that evening, arrogance dripping from her every move, she believed she was about to extort more money from a grieving mother. But the lights would soon flip on, the screens would come alive with her crimes, and the walls she had built around her lies would collapse. And just as Catherine prepared for the confrontation, more mothers began to step forward. Women from New York, Atlanta, Miami, each with stories eerily similar, each with a child lost to Veronica's manipulation. Their voices built a storm that no lie could silence. But could Catherine hold herself together when the world learned how close she had come to losing her daughter? Could she face the shame of knowing her absence had made room for this monster to thrive? The answers lay in the climax that was about to unfold, one that would bring Veronica Salazar face to face with the truth, the law, and the mothers she had deceived. The evening came heavy with tension. The air inside the penthouse charged like a storm about to break. Catherine sat still in the center of her living room, her face calm but her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles whitened. Hidden cameras dotted the corners, investigators lingered behind concealed doors, and a news crew waited silently, ready to reveal the truth. This was no ordinary confrontation, it was a stage set for justice. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and then she appeared. Lillian Vargas, Veronica Salazar in her true identity, strolled in as though she owned the place. Draped in one of Catherine's designer gowns, her fingers adorned with stolen jewelry, she exuded a confidence so brazen it made the room feel colder. She sat down, crossed her legs, and began to speak about her salary increase, her voice dripping with arrogance. But before she could finish, the lights shifted. Screens hidden along the walls flickered to life, and the room was filled with the haunting images Catherine had seen in private. Olivia, sobbing in darkness, sedated, her small frame locked in a closet. Veronica's voice, sharp and cruel, calling her worthless, telling her she would never be loved. Veronica's smug smile faltered. The images rolled on, other children, other homes. Scenes of suffering carefully recorded and archived, now playing before strangers who had come to witness the truth. Each clip was a dagger, cutting through the polished lies she had spun. And then, from the shadows, voices rose. Mothers stepped forward, women who had flown in from New York, Atlanta, Miami. Their faces bore the scars of grief. Their words poured into the room like an unstoppable tide. Each recounted the same pattern. Veronica infiltrating their lives, gaining trust, isolating their children, and leaving devastation behind. The weight of their testimonies filled the air until it was almost suffocating. Veronica shifted uneasily in her chair, her confidence crumbling with each passing second. Still, she tried to laugh it off, claiming exaggeration, insisting the mothers were unstable, even daring to say that children often needed tough love. But the footage could not be denied. Neither could the testimonies. And when the federal agents finally stepped forward, badges glinting under the harsh lights, Veronica's mask cracked completely. She bolted for the door, desperate to escape the walls closing in around her. She didn't make it 3 steps. Officers swarmed, restraining her as she screamed, her voice shrill and venomous, spitting curses in Spanish and English alike. Cameras captured every moment. The world would not only hear her crimes, they would see them. As she was dragged back into the center of the room, the investigators read out the truth. Veronica Salazar, leader of an organized criminal network spanning multiple states, is responsible for exploiting wealthy families, abusing children, and selling their suffering for profit. She had more than a dozen aliases, more than a dozen lives built on lies, and now every one of them was collapsing before her. Catherine stood in silence, her eyes locked on the woman who had nearly destroyed her daughter. Every instinct screamed for her to shout, to curse, to demand answers, but she held back. Her silence was louder than rage. For once, the power was not in Veronica's hands. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Veronica sneered. She looked Catherine in the eye and hissed that Olivia was weak, that children like her were easy to break, that there would always be more prey. The words struck like poison, but they also lit a fire. Catherine realized this was not just about Olivia anymore. It was about every child who had been trapped, silenced, and forgotten. The officers moved to escort Veronica away, but Catherine's security chief, Richard Lawson, stepped forward with one final piece of evidence. From the seized hard drives, investigators had traced dozens of transactions, videos of abused children sold to hidden buyers across Europe. The numbers flashed on the screen. $600 per video, hundreds of files exchanged in secret. Gasps rippled through the room. This was not just cruelty. This was commerce built on the suffering of children. Veronica's last smirk disappeared when she saw the faces of the reporters watching. Her empire of lies was no longer hidden. Her mask had been ripped away in front of the world. The climax of years of deception, pain, and silence had arrived in this single, searing moment. As she was dragged out in handcuffs, cameras capturing every second, Catherine felt both a collapse and a rise within her. The collapse of the guilt she had carried in silence. The rise of something stronger, resolve, purpose, clarity. The scene closed with Olivia's small voice from a hospital bed playing on the screen. Not crying, not broken, but laughing faintly during her recovery. It was proof that even in the deepest cruelty, innocence could survive. But Catherine also knew this was only the beginning. Because if Veronica had been able to infiltrate her world so easily, how many others were still out there, hiding behind false names, preying on vulnerable families? The question would not let her rest. And so the climax ended not with relief, but with a challenge. A call to confront the darkness that thrived in silence. 3 months later, the echoes of that night still lingered, but the silence was no longer filled with fear. It was filled with purpose. Catherine Morgan, once consumed by boardrooms and stock markets, now stood on a stage in New York before a crowd of advocates, journalists, and grieving families. Behind her glowed the name of a new foundation, the Olivia Morgan Foundation for Child Protection. In just 90 days, the foundation had rescued over 300 children from abusive or exploitative environments. They had been placed in safe homes, given access to therapy, and offered the kind of support that prevents wounds from becoming lifelong scars. Catherine had poured her wealth and influence into something no balance sheet could measure, restoring childhood to those robbed of it. For Catherine, this was more than philanthropy. It was redemption. The guilt of her absence could never be erased, but it could be transformed into action. She spoke with a conviction that came not from corporate training, but from personal pain. Each word was a vow that what had happened to Olivia, and to so many others, would never be allowed to thrive in silence again. Meanwhile, Veronica Salazar sat behind the walls of a federal prison. She faced a 50-year sentence for child abuse, organized crime, and money laundering. Her accomplices, 14 women who had built their lives on deception, were stripped of their aliases and exposed for what they were. Even more shocking, several officials who had secretly shielded their operations were investigated and brought to justice. The network that once fed on silence and shadows had been dismantled. Yet Catherine knew the story was bigger than one arrest. Racism had shaped every stage of it. Olivia had been reduced to begging for food, but the neighbor who answered her cries was Mrs. Harriet, the elderly black maid who had nothing to give but still offered bread and compassion. While those with privilege had looked away, it was a woman long overlooked by society who had shown humanity in its truest form. This truth cut deep. Too often, the very people marginalized by wealth and race become the ones carrying the weight of kindness, while systems of privilege allow predators to flourish. Veronica had been able to operate for so long because the suffering of children, especially those under the care of trusted figures, is too easily dismissed. Racism doesn't always appear in grand, visible acts. It thrives in the quiet, where voices like Harriet's are ignored, where a maid's warnings carry less weight than a nanny's lies, where power shields cruelty until it becomes undeniable. Catherine often returned to that moment at the iron fence. Her daughter's skeletal frame pressed against the bars, hands reaching for bread, and an elderly black woman offering what little she had. In that single image, the illusions of wealth collapsed. All the status, all the money, all the polished facades. None of it had protected Olivia. What had saved her was the compassion of someone society rarely values. That realization became the beating heart of the foundation. It was not only about rescuing children, but about listening to the unheard, elevating the voices that too often go unnoticed. Catherine used her platform to highlight the systemic inequalities that allowed predators to thrive, calling out the dangerous combination of wealth, silence, and racial bias. The impact was undeniable. News outlets picked up the story, sparking national conversations about child safety, accountability, and the hidden ways racism shapes who is believed and who is dismissed. Families across the country began questioning the systems they trusted blindly. And children, those whose voices had been silenced, were finally being heard. As for Olivia, the transformation was profound. She had regained her strength, her laughter, her spark. The frail child who once begged for bread now stood beside her mother at foundation events, smiling shyly at the crowds. Though scars remained, her resilience shone through. Catherine often said that Olivia had given her not just a second chance as a mother, but a mission that extended beyond her own family. The story could have ended with despair, could have been just another tragedy buried beneath headlines. But instead, it became a testament to resilience, to accountability, and to the power of shining light into darkness. And yet, the lingering question cannot be ignored. How many more children are still hidden behind closed doors, silenced by fear, dismissed by privilege, waiting for someone to notice? That is the weight this story leaves behind. It is not just Catherine's burden, nor Olivia's, nor the families who spoke out. It belongs to all of us, to listen, to believe, to act, because the true measure of a society is not in its wealth, but in how it protects its most vulnerable. So I leave you with this. If one billionaire's daughter could be starved in silence, what about the children with no wealth, no voice, no spotlight? And what will we choose to do, knowing their cries may already be echoing in the dark? You've just seen how one act of cruelty and silence nearly destroyed a child, and how compassion, courage, and truth brought her back. Stories like this aren't just about one family. They shine a light on injustice that still exists all around us. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and join this community by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Together, we can keep these voices alive.